Hi again. Sophie Glenn here, and today we're going to be talking about the bandsaw. Now, the bandsaw is one of the most versatile tools that you can own in a wood shop, and we use it quite frequently in this shop for a multitude of different things. The nice thing about it is that you could make straight cuts with it, you can do curved cuts with it, and you don't necessarily need a nice flat piece of wood like you do for the table saw. So you could start out with a pretty wonky looking piece of wood and cut pretty much anything out of it. And you can also make angled cuts and all sorts of different things. So it's a really versatile tool. So I would say, like, if you're trying to start your own shop later on in life and you're looking for specific tools that you might want to buy in the future, a bandsaw should definitely be on that list. So a couple of things about this bandsaw. This is a 14-inch bandsaw. So if I were to raise this guide up, you can go all the way up to 14 inches. So I have a pretty wide depth of cut I can get on this. So I can take a 14-inch wide piece of wood and cut on it, no problem. And I can also go as small as like 1/8 inch or 1/16 of an inch even. So it's very versatile in that respect. And the reason it's called a bandsaw is if I open these doors, hopefully you can see two wheels on here that are holding a bandsaw in place. And if I were to spin these wheels, it's basically acting just like a regular saw would and doing that work for me and just putting all that motion downward, making a cut. All right? So it's a stationary cutting tool. Unlike the compound miter saw, where you're actually bringing the blade towards you a bit, this one is actually stays in place and you push the piece of wood into it while you're cutting. So yeah, and then if I were to show you how to raise and lower this, there's a little lock back here. So hopefully you see that in this video here. It's right behind this little wheel here. And I can lower this, or I could raise it upward. And again, if I raise this all the way up to 14 inches, then I can cut something that's 14 inches wide. So it's a really versatile tool. This one happens to have a 3/8 inch blade on it. And you can get blades in different widths, and those different widths would be useful for all sorts of different things. So if you have a wider blade, for example, that might be great for resawing. So if you're making, if you're taking a log, for example, and making boards out of it, then a resaw blade would be perfect for that. Or if you're making your own veneer, then you would need a resaw blade. The 3/8 inch blade here is pretty much a general purpose blade. Not going to be great for resawing because you need that nice thick blade or wide blade for that, but this is great for cutting curves. You can cut straight lines. So it's great for a multitude of different things. So I'll raise this back down. So when you've raised and lowered it to your desired height, then you just lock it back into place here, and I'll go over that again. So before I actually start cutting on here, I want to go over some sort of safety precautions you should take before coming onto here. So you'll see that I have my safety glasses on, and I also have my earmuffs in place because this is loud, and just like every other machine in here, it gets pretty loud. So if you're sensitive to that, you definitely want to have some hearing protection. If you're a little bit sensitive to wood dust, you might also want to wear like a little paper mask or some sort of dust mask. That's not really required. You also want to make sure that the area is clean before you start working, just like any other machine in here. So free of any debris, and you don't want anything on the floor. Like we have a nice little mat here, so it keeps it from being slippery. But wood dust does get slippery too, so you just want to make sure everything's nice and clean for you. Yeah, so that's pretty much the safety precautions there in terms of attire and just sort of general work area. But just a few other safety precautions with this. Because this is versatile in a lot of different ways, once you start to get comfortable with it, you can get a little bit more confident in it. So with that to say, you don't want to get overconfident on this machine. Because unlike the saw stop table saw, where it has a device in it that'll keep from cutting into meat, moisture, or flesh, or metal, this does not have that technology. So if you make a wrong move on here into your thumb or into one of your digits, that's a done deal, unfortunately. So you never want to get too overconfident on this machine, and that's pretty much standard with any of the machines in here, really. When you are choosing wood to cut on here, you kind of just like the planer and the joiner, you want to make sure that's free of any knots and nails or staples or anything like that, because again, we're dealing with the steel blade, so those metal bits can destroy the blade, and we don't want to do that. If you're cutting wet wood, like say if you're going to do some wet wood turning on the lathe, you can do that, but it's really important that you either change the blade out when you're done or to clean it off so it doesn't rust over time. And again, like any kind of pines or sort of sappy woods will also gunk up that blade. So you can cut them on here, but then just make sure that you clean it off with clean the blade off with a brass brush afterwards. Say that 4 times fast. So you typically you'd want to saw new wood on here, but again, you can do any kind of shape or size that you want, really. You never want to open these doors when the machine is on, and that's basically as a safety precaution in case the blade breaks, it doesn't break into your face. Really, unless someone like myself or a shop tech is working on it or changing a blade out, these doors should really never be open. But if it is open for whatever reason, I could just shut it and then just lock it in place with this little lock here, and that should keep it under control. But again, it shouldn't really be open for any real reason. Be cautious of exposed blades. So you saw that I raised and lowered this to a varying height, right? But with that said, if you have too much height on here when you're cutting a piece of wood, then your fingers are that much more exposed to a very dangerous blade. So a general rule of thumb is to do about 1/4 of an inch above the surface of whatever you're cutting. So say I'm cutting this piece of plywood here, it's about 3/4 of an inch thick. You go just a 1/4 inch above that just to clear it, and that's actually good right around there. But say if it was way high like this, so if I want to cut this, then my fingers are exposed to that much blade, and I don't want that. So you always want to go just a 1/4 inch above that surface. So I can lower this back down. It doesn't have to be exactly a 1/4 inch, but as long as it's in the ballpark and it clears all the little bits back here, then you should be good to go. So right around there is pretty good. So I can lock that back into place now. Okay. So you want to, when you're actually cutting on here and you're getting towards the end of your cut, what you want to do is actually slow down when you're cutting. So you can move wood through this thing pretty quickly, especially if it's a brand new blade on here. So it really shouldn't take a lot of force to actually push a piece of wood through it, and I'll get more into that in just a second. But when you're getting towards the end of a cut, what's happening is that blade is going under a lot of pressure from having done all that cutting so far. So what will happen is if you're going too quick or if you're pushing too hard up against that blade, it's going to want to pop forward, and it might actually pop it out of its position on here. So when you're nearing the end of a cut, you always just want to slow down and kind of just let the blade do its job. So do very minimal pushing forward when you're nearing towards the end of a cut. Okay, so I have a push stick here for a reason. So I've talked about push sticks before in other videos, particularly the table saw, but they also work great for the bandsaw too. So generally speaking, if you're cutting, say if you're cutting like little sticks, and you're trying to make little cubes or something, so you're dealing with a bunch of little tiny pieces, or if you're nearing towards the end of a cut and your fingers are getting really close to that blade, what you'll want to do is use a push stick instead, because this is a sacrificial hand, right? So I can actually cut little pieces, and once I get, so if I have a long piece, I can pull it from back here and then finish pushing it forward that way, and that would help keep my fingers out of the line of the cut, right? Again, I'll demonstrate this once I actually start cutting on here. So right now it probably doesn't make too much sense, but I'll get into that. So with that, you always want to keep your fingers out of the line of the cut, fingers and thumbs, right? All digits. Because again, this does not have that soft stop technology where it's going to know if it's cutting into my finger. So I want to make sure that my fingers are totally out of the way, and that's why we have a push stick available. It doesn't necessarily have to be this push stick. It could just be just a stick that you push forward with. But again, we want to keep all of our digits intact. Main goal in woodshop. Surface of the stock must be flat when you're cutting. So you can actually cut curved pieces. So say I have this piece, right? It's got some weird little wonky shape to it. It doesn't necessarily have a flat side to it, unless it's just these two sides. So typically, if I'm cutting something like this, right, and that blade is pushing all that force downward, it's going to want to push this downward too. So as long as you have at least 2 points of contact, you should be good to go. So here, it's not necessarily flat, but I got two nice flat spots on both ends here, and that should keep it from wanting to be all wonky on you and put all that pressure downward. If you're in a situation where you only have curved surfaces, so say you're cutting like a really curvy bandsaw box in half or something, or maybe you're cutting a round shape, like part of a log, for example, then what you would do is you would actually start downward and then kind of creep your way downward to the other end like that. So you're always putting that pressure downwards, and the blade is actually not, it's doing its job and not pushing it downward for you. So you're basically angling that in and kind of matching that curve as best as you can. All right? Okay. So avoid backing out of a long cut. So say I have this piece again, and I'm cutting most of the way through and realize I'm making a mistake. So what I don't want to do is back out of that really long cut, because that could also jerk that blade out of its position. So what I would do in that case, I would stop the machine, let it come to a full stop, and then pull my piece of wood out. Right? Another thing you can do, so say you're making a curve in a shape. So let's see if I do. So if I'm trying to cut this half circle out, right? Or I'm going to cut this thing out. And the blade, depending on the width of your blade, I'll get a little closer here. So depending on the width of your blade, it's not necessarily going to make that curve that easily. So what I would do instead is make a series of straight cuts in here first. All right, so I'll cut all the way to my semicircle. And then when I start to make this curve, these pieces will actually get cut out, and that'll give that blade a little bit of relief to make that curve all the way around. So that's why we call them relief cuts. And I'll demonstrate that too once we actually start cutting. But typically speaking, you just want to, you don't want to put that blade under a lot of tension because it could possibly break or bind in place, and we try not to do that whenever we can. In the event that that does happen, or if a blade breaks, what you would do is you just stop the machine, and you can even stop it more quickly with just this emergency brake down here. And you let the wheels come to a complete stop, and then come get the shop tech or myself to come change the blade out for you. And that's another reason why we keep these doors closed, right? So if the blade breaks, it stays in the machine and not in your face. All right, okay. So before we actually start working, we want to make sure that the area is clean, like I said before. You also want to make sure that the table angle is set correctly. So you could actually tilt this table to a 45-degree angle. So I'll just raise this up a little bit just to show you. This side right here. So there's a little lock back here. Should be able to either tilt this in place or not. See? Mine's being a little stiff right now, but that's okay. But this table should be able to reach about a 45-degree angle. So if you're cutting at a 45, you can set it to that, or set it to whatever angle you're trying to cut. But you just want to make sure that it's set back to 90 for the next person who's going to use it. Or if you're cutting at 90, you want to make sure it's already set at 90. And to do that, it usually bottoms out at 90 degrees. There's a little stop behind here that helps it bottom out at 90. You can also take a combination square and just double check that it's at 90 degrees. Okay. You also want to adjust the guides on here. So again, you can just unlock it here and just raise and lower this to, again, a 1/4 inch above whatever surface that you're cutting. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll cut this guy here. So lower that down. That's good right there. And you want to make sure that the dust collection's on. So if you're going to be making a lot of cuts on here, then definitely have the dust collection on, and make sure that the gate is open back here. Right, so this little gate is open back here. If you're just making maybe a couple of little cuts and not really accumulating a lot of dust, then you don't really need the dust collection. But again, if you're going to be making a ton of cuts, then definitely have the dust collection on. Okay, so I'll go ahead and cut this guy. And just note the position of my hands when I'm cutting. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to just let the machine kind of do its job. And slowly I'll reach my hand backward when I get towards the end, and I'll push forward on one corner. So my hands are going to be out of the direction of the blade. And again, just note where my hands are when I'm cutting. So to turn it on, you just push the green button in. So my fingers are on the side here. Slowing down at the end of my cut. Just like that, I got 2 pieces of wood. To stop it, I push the red button in. And again, I can slow it down by just stepping on that, and it stops it right in place. So this is typically an emergency brake, but for the purposes of the video, so I'm not wasting time, I'm just using that to stop it a little quicker. But you shouldn't really have to use that on a regular basis. So some things to keep aware of when you're using this machine and to stop it if it happens. If the blade is really dull, which you can tell by either it's burning the wood or if it's really hard to push your piece of wood through, you just want to make sure to stop what you're doing and alert the shop tech or myself of that the blade needs to be changed out or cleaned. Because a dull blade is actually going to make your job a lot harder, and it's actually a lot more dangerous, so you want to make sure that it's working properly. With that in mind too, you want to make sure that the blade is also tracking properly. So sometimes, typically if the blade gets bound up, like making a sharp curve or something like that, it'll kind of go off its track and do some weird little wonky things in here. So if it's doing that, and you see that before you start cutting, just make sure to turn the machine off again and let your shop tech or myself know about it, so we can go ahead and fix that. And again, if the blade breaks, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Just make sure to stop the machine. So again, just push this red button in. You can even do the emergency thing, because that's considered an emergency in that case. And keep these doors closed. Again, you should not have a reason to really open these. And then just take a step back. So it's going to be a little jarring at first when the blade does break. It actually happened to me in a demo once. That was really exciting. So just be aware of that. All right. So I'll go ahead and demo just making that curve cut again, or sorry, the relief cuts. So doing a curved surface like that. And because these are like short enough cuts, I can back out of them pretty easily, but if it's like a really long cut, then you don't want to do it. I've got my relief cuts there, so now I'll try cutting out the entire thing. Scrap there, I want to make sure that the bandsaw is totally stopped. And again, I can, for the purposes of the video, I'll stop it there. So once it's totally stopped, then I can push away all of this stuff, right? Again, if I tried to do this while it was running, that would have been a very bad day. Just to show you. So that's my curve. So now I can clean that up on one of the sanders, like the spindle sander, and that'd be a nice, ready to go piece. So that's pretty much the bandsaw.